Imagine you're standing in a ballroom in 1860, your waist cinched so tightly you can barely draw breath, surrounded by 6 feet of steel hoops and silk that cost more than a laborer's annual wage. The champagne you sipped an hour ago is now making urgent demands, but there's no discreet exit, no modern restroom down a hallway. Instead, you face a choice that would horrify any modern woman: risk public humiliation, or deploy a system so ingenious, so carefully choreographed, that it bordered on performance art. What you're about to discover isn't just embarrassing history. It's a testament to female ingenuity under impossible constraints. Before we descend into the hidden world of Victorian bathroom rituals, I'm genuinely curious. Where in the world are you right now? Drop your city or country in the comments because it absolutely fascinates me that we can gather from Melbourne to Manchester, from Toronto to Tokyo, all united by this peculiar hunger to understand how people actually lived. And if you're finding this journey as compelling as I am, subscribe now because we're only beginning to excavate history's most uncomfortable truths. The Victorian toilet crisis wasn't a design flaw. It was a direct consequence of fashion as social control. Between 1837 and 1901, women's clothing reached its most architecturally ambitious, most physically restrictive, and most biologically impractical peak in Western history. The question wasn't whether women could use the toilet while wearing these mobile prisons. The question was how they managed it without collapsing, without servants gossiping, and without ever acknowledging the animal reality of their own bodies. To understand the daily ordeal Victorian women endured, we must first reconstruct the sheer engineering challenge they inhabited from dawn until dusk. This was the age of the crinoline, from the French crin, meaning horsehair, a cage-like frame that transformed the female form into something architectural, something monumental. But the crinoline was merely the most visible component of a much more elaborate system, one that Queen Victoria herself endorsed and that every respectable woman was expected to master. The foundation began with the chemise, a thin linen shift that absorbed sweat and protected expensive outer garments from the oils of human skin. Over this came the corset, not the romantic garment of modern costume drama, but a medical intervention made of whalebone or steel that physicians in the Lancet Journal documented as causing permanent rib deformation, liver displacement, and chronic digestive disorders. Women were routinely laced to achieve 13-inch waists. The actress Lily Langtry famously measured 18 inches and was considered almost scandalously voluptuous. Above the corset, the petticoats began. Not 1 or 2, but typically 5 to 7 separate layers, each adding volume, each adding weight. A fully dressed Victorian lady of means carried between 15 and 20 pounds of fabric on her lower body alone. Then came the crinoline proper, initially made of horsehair-stiffened fabric but by the 1850s constructed from flexible steel hoops connected by vertical tapes. These structures could extend 18 inches in every direction from the body, creating a dome of fabric so large that doorways had to be navigated sideways, chairs required special design, and simple acts like sitting in a carriage became elaborate geometric problems. The Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace featured a special display addressing the crinoline question, acknowledging what everyone knew but few discussed: women were physically imprisoned by their own clothing. The Times of London published editorials about women unable to pass through shop entrances. Punch magazine ran satirical cartoons showing crinolines getting caught in machinery, knocking over furniture, and taking up entire railway compartments. These weren't exaggerations, they were documented hazards. Now, layer onto this architectural nightmare the biological reality that Victorian women drank tea, consumed soup, and required hydration just like any human being. The polite fiction was that ladies simply didn't have bodily functions. The medical reality was very different, and it required a parallel infrastructure as elaborate as the sewage systems being constructed beneath London's streets during the same period. The chamber pot became the central technology of female bodily autonomy. These weren't crude vessels. They were precision instruments, often commissioned from the finest porcelain manufacturers in England and France. The women's chamber pot was oval rather than round, designed specifically to fit between layers of fabric and the cage of the crinoline without tipping. The interior was glazed smooth for ease of cleaning. The rim was often padded with fabric or rubber to prevent noise. Quality examples featured tight-fitting lids that served two purposes: containing odor and signaling to servants whether the pot required emptying. In wealthy households, chamber pots were hidden inside what Victorians called necessary furniture. The close stool disguised itself as an elegant chair with a hinged seat. The commode resembled a fashionable cabinet but contained a porcelain pot accessible through a small door. Some bedroom suites included entire dressing tables with concealed compartments designed for this purpose. Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861 and considered the definitive guide to running a proper Victorian home, devoted an entire chapter to the maintenance and discreet placement of these essential items, though she never once used the word toilet or acknowledged their actual function. The logistics of using a chamber pot while wearing a crinoline required physical coordination that bordered on acrobatic. A woman couldn't simply lift her skirts. We're discussing a volume of fabric equivalent to a small tent, reinforced by steel hoops that had structural memory and would spring back into shape. The technique, passed from mothers to daughters in whispered instruction, involved positioning the oval pot on the floor, then carefully stepping over it so the pot was centered beneath the widest point of the crinoline. The steel hoops would naturally lift as the woman lowered herself into a squat, the fabric draping around her like a tent. The split in her drawers, which we'll discuss shortly, allowed her to complete the act without removing a single garment. But this was only possible in private spaces. At social functions, the challenge multiplied exponentially. Grand estates and fashionable townhouses included retiring rooms, essentially Victorian powder rooms, but these were far more elaborate than modern restrooms. They were staffed lounges where ladies could retire to refresh themselves. The euphemism everyone understood. Mrs. Beeton's guide specified that a proper party of 50 guests required at least 2 retiring rooms, each attended by a maid whose sole responsibility was assisting with the complex business of Victorian elimination. These maids were specialists. They knew how to maneuver a crinoline in a confined space, how to position the pot for optimal stability, how to hold back the multiple layers of fabric without crushing them or disturbing the elaborate arrangements of bows and ruffles. They provided cleanup assistance with dampened cloths and rosewater. Most importantly, they maintained absolute discretion. A lady's maid who gossiped about her employer's bodily functions would never work in a respectable household again. The system worked, but it worked through the invisible labor of working-class women and the careful architecture of social silence. No one acknowledged what was happening. No one discussed it. When a lady excused herself to attend to her toilette, everyone at the dinner party understood, but the polite fiction was maintained that she was merely checking her hair or adjusting a ribbon. Yet here's where Victorian bathroom culture takes a turn that genuinely shocks modern sensibilities. For most of the 19th century, respectable women wore no closed underwear whatsoever. The sheer volume of petticoats and crinolines was considered sufficient coverage. A woman's legs and intimate anatomy were protected not by undergarments, but by multiple layers of fabric and the structural cage of the crinoline itself. This changed not because of modesty concerns, but because of physics. Crinolines were essentially enormous kites attached to women's waists. When wind caught them, the results were catastrophic. The English Woman's Domestic Magazine documented multiple incidents of women's skirts being blown completely over their heads on public streets, exposing everything underneath, which was, in the 1850s, absolutely nothing beyond layers of petticoats. The solution arrived in the form of the most ingenious garment ever designed: split crotch drawers, sometimes called open drawers in period inventories. These consisted of 2 separate pant legs attached to a waistband, with no fabric connecting them in the middle. The opening was often 12 to 15 inches wide, completely unobstructed. This design was revolutionary precisely because it solved the fundamental problem. How do you provide modesty protection while still allowing a woman to urinate without removing any clothing? The genius was in the strategic void. With split-crotch drawers, a Victorian woman could lower herself over a chamber pot, and the open construction meant nothing had to be moved, unbuttoned, or adjusted. The system worked seamlessly with the crinoline logistics. Fashion historians have recovered examples of these garments from museum collections, often beautifully made from fine cotton or linen, trimmed with lace and ribbons, embroidered with the owner's initials. They were intimate garments, never seen by anyone except perhaps a husband or lady's maid, yet they were often more beautifully constructed than outer clothing. But the bathroom challenges extended far beyond mere mechanics. Consider what Victorians used instead of toilet paper, which didn't become commercially available until the 1880s and wasn't widely adopted until the early 20th century. In working-class homes, people used torn newspaper, catalog pages, or corn cobs. Wealthier households employed squares of soft fabric, often old linen napkins or sheeting cut into manageable sizes. These fabric squares were collected in a separate container, then laundered by servants in a process kept entirely separate from regular household laundry. The Handbook of the Toilet, published anonymously in 1841, recommended that ladies maintain a supply of soft, cambric cloths for intimate hygiene, to be washed in mild soap and water, then bleached in sunlight. The text never explicitly states what these cloths were for, maintaining the era's commitment to euphemism, but household inventories from estate sales frequently list toilet linens among the contents of ladies' chambers. Then there was menstruation, a biological reality that Victorian society worked extraordinarily hard to pretend didn't exist. Medical texts of the period referred to it as the monthly indisposition, or simply being unwell, and the burden of managing it fell entirely on individual women with almost no commercial products available until the 1890s. Victorian women constructed their own menstrual pads from layers of linen, cotton, or flannel, held in place by a cloth belt system called a sanitary apron. These homemade pads had to be changed frequently, often every 2 to 3 hours during heavy flow, creating a logistical nightmare for women who might spend an entire afternoon at a social call or garden party. The used cloths had to be discreetly concealed on one's person until they could be properly disposed of, or, more commonly, washed for reuse. The washing itself was a burden that highlighted the class divide. Wealthy women had servants who handled this most intimate labor, soaking the soiled linens in cold water, then washing them separately in a process kept invisible from the rest of the household. Working-class women washed their own menstrual cloths, often at night, and dried them near the kitchen fire where their purpose would be least obvious. A woman's entire wardrobe planning had to account for her menstrual cycle, dark colors during unwell days, extra petticoats for additional security, careful timing of social engagements. Dr. Edward Tilt, a prominent Victorian gynecologist, published a treatise in 1857, noting that many of his upper-class patients suffered from anxiety disorders related to the fear of menstrual accidents during social occasions. He didn't recommend better sanitary products, which didn't exist, but rather suggested that women should limit their social activities during menstruation, advice that was impractical for anyone who had social or familial obligations. The cleaning and maintenance of Victorian clothing added yet another dimension to these challenges. Those elaborate dresses couldn't be washed in any conventional sense. The combination of steel frameworks, delicate fabrics, intricate beading, and sheer size made laundering impossible. Instead, dresses were maintained through careful brushing, airing out on dress frames, and spot cleaning of stains. Many households conducted major laundry only twice yearly, during events called Great Wash Days that consumed a week of household labor. This meant that the outer garments, the gowns that cost a fortune and signaled social status, were rarely, if ever, washed in the modern sense. They were worn repeatedly, brushed clean, and treated with sachets of lavender and powders designed to absorb oils and odors. The inner layers, the chemise and later the drawers, were washed weekly or even more frequently. These washable layers served as a barrier, protecting the expensive outer garments from the oils, sweat, and biological reality of the human body beneath. Isabella Beeton's household manual specified that a lady should own at least a dozen chemises to allow for frequent washing and proper rotation. The implication was clear. These inner garments bore the burden of actual bodily contact and required constant maintenance that the visible clothing could never receive. This system of inner and outer layers, washable and unwashable, reflected the Victorian compartmentalization of the body itself. The external presentation, the gown and crinoline, existed in the realm of social performance and artistic expression. The internal reality, the sweat and elimination and menstruation, was managed through invisible layers and invisible labor, never acknowledged, never discussed. Consider the case of Lady Charlotte Bertram, whose private diary from 1862, now housed in the British Library, provides a rare window into these daily struggles. Charlotte was the daughter of an earl, married to a diplomat, and her social obligations required her to attend multiple events daily during the London season. Her diary entries, written in a personal shorthand she clearly never expected anyone to decode, reveal the constant anxiety of managing bodily functions within the constraints of fashion and propriety. On May 14, 1862, Charlotte attended a garden party at Holland House that began at 2 in the afternoon and continued past 7 in the evening. Her diary entry notes, 5 hours without retiring. The anguish became unbearable by 4 o'clock, but the crush was too great to navigate to the retiring room without causing comment. Feared I would disgrace myself. When I finally reached assistance, I was shaking. The maid was kind, but I saw the pity in her eyes. This cannot continue. Charlotte's solution, recorded over subsequent entries, was to severely limit her fluid intake before any social engagement. She would drink nothing after noon if she had an afternoon obligation. Before evening events, she stopped drinking entirely after breakfast. Her diary documents headaches, dizziness, and what she called a perpetual parched feeling. She was inducing chronic dehydration to avoid the humiliation of needing to use a chamber pot too frequently or too urgently. Her experience was not unusual. Medical journals from the period document what physicians called social bladder syndrome, a condition where women trained their bodies to suppress the urge to urinate for extended periods. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the few female physicians of the era, published a paper in 1876 noting that many of her patients suffered from chronic urinary tract infections and bladder problems directly attributable to habitually delaying urination for social reasons. Charlotte's diary also reveals the elaborate signaling system women developed. At crowded events, when the retiring rooms had long waits, women would discreetly signal each other. A particular adjustment of a fan meant, "I need to leave soon." A specific way of touching one's necklace meant, "Urgent, can you help me navigate out?" This silent language allowed women to assist each other without ever speaking the unspeakable. Imagine standing in an 1860 ballroom, your waist crushed by a steel corset, trapped in 6 feet of silk and hoops. Beneath the elegance was the unspoken Victorian toilet crisis, a problem born not of bad design, but of fashion as social control. Between 1837 and 1901, women's clothing became architectural torture. Corsets deformed ribs and organs, petticoats and crinolines weighed over 15 pounds, and every movement demanded calculation. Without restrooms, women relied on chamber pots, oval, porcelain vessels hidden inside necessary furniture. Using one beneath steel hoops required near acrobatic precision, stepping over, squatting carefully, relying on split-crotch drawers that allowed urination without removing garments. Maids, trained in discretion, assisted in retiring rooms, maintaining the polite illusion that women had no bodily needs. Servants handled cleanup, while working women managed alone, washing and hiding what society refused to acknowledge. Toilet paper didn't exist. Soft fabric cloths or cut linens were used and discreetly laundered. Menstruation, spoken of only as monthly indisposition, was managed with homemade pads tied by cloth belts, washed separately in secret. Fashion demanded silence even about pain. Women like Lady Charlotte Bertram recorded in diaries how they avoided drinking water for hours, terrified of needing relief in public. Doctors documented infections, constipation, and organ displacement, but blamed female delicacy, not the clothes that crushed their bodies. By the 1880s, reformers like the Rational Dress Society fought back, insisting clothing should not weigh more than 7 pounds or restrict movement. They were mocked as unfeminine, but practicality eventually triumphed. The bicycle, women's work, and war finally ended fashion's cruelest constraints. The Victorian toilet crisis was never merely about bathrooms. It revealed how society demanded women deny their bodies to preserve decorum. Yet, through quiet ingenuity and mutual support, they maintained dignity within cages of silk and steel. The chamber pots have vanished, but their story endures a reminder that no matter how tightly society laces its expectations, the body and the will to be human cannot be suppressed.